Story 1. I remember working flooded houses in Araby and Chalmette for months. The National Guard was posted outside Chalmette 24 hours a day. Access was only granted to homeowners and insurance adjusters. You had to have a four-wheel drive vehicle. You had to sign a waiver acknowledging dangerous conditions like sinkholes, live electrical wires, snakes, unstable structures, and more. You had to acknowledge that there was no power, no water, no cell service, and no emergency services to respond. Basically, you were told you would not be rescued if you entered. The place was dead. No sound of car traffic. No birds. No crickets. Only the wind, and it was strange. The National Guard would patrol. If they found you, you had to show identification, and they gave you a case of water and a case of meals ready to eat. There was about a foot of muddy salt covering everything, so you could not tell where the street, sidewalk, curb, or yard started. They ran giant bulldozers down the middle of the street and pushed debris, mud, trees, cars, boats, oil drums, refrigerators, into the drainage canals to make a crude path that served as the road. The silt from the Mississippi River settled inside and outside the houses. 6 inches of mud inside the house made opening doors impossible, so you had to climb through broken windows to get pictures of damages. I would work 8 to 10 hours a day in Chalmette, and I would not see anyone except the National Guard Humvee about every 3 days. Dead birds, deer, dogs, cats, raccoons, and snakes were everywhere. Oil lines were all the way up the houses, inside and out. When you left, you checked out with the National Guard, and they would spray your waders and your vehicle down with a fire hose. About 10 minutes outside Chalmette, your cell service would come back. However, there were no gas stations, restaurants, or stores for miles. When a store opened, it would sell out of everything in a matter of hours, then shut down again for 2 or 3 days until another delivery arrived. Story 2. Seeing X spray painted on houses after search and rescue teams went through is chilling. Story 3. I was in boot camp. The night before the storm made landfall, the drill instructor came out and put us in formation. He told us about the storm, but none of us really understood what he was saying except for one kid, who was from New Orleans. The phrase looked like he had seen a ghost, doesn't even capture it. His eyes were completely vacant, and he was trembling. Once the drill instructor left, we tried to console him with normal phrases like, "Don't worry about it," and "It's going to be fine." He kept saying, "You guys don't understand," and sort of withdrew into himself. They kept letting him use the phone to check in with his family, but it was no use. The kid spent the remaining weeks unsure what happened to his family, or if they were even alive. Story 4. My family lives in Biloxi and Gulfport, Mississippi. All the media coverage was on New Orleans, but nothing about Biloxi and Gulfport. They were severely impacted, with devastating damage that can still be seen today. What a terrible storm. Story 5. New Orleans television declared that the city dodged the bullet. Then, a few hours later, the failure mode of the industrial canal levees, which had been explained to me by engineering students 25 years earlier, became evident. Story 6. Probably too much, I remember too much. South Mississippian, the path of the eye was about 25 miles away from my house. Here are some highlights. Technically, it never hit New Orleans, it skirted by it. It slammed into Mississippi, but everyone was focused on New Orleans. That's understandable considering the damage caused by the levees failing. However, many of us who were actually hit by Hurricane Katrina felt forgotten or like an afterthought. Hours of sideways rain. No seagulls in my area, but one was resting on my porch during the height of the storm. I guess it got blown in by the storm. I hoped it was a good omen. Not having power in my tiny, isolated town for 4 to 6 weeks in southern Mississippi in August and September was absolutely brutal. No escape from the heat and humidity. I had to sleep outside and deal with mosquitoes because it was still too hot inside even at night. No businesses were open. A local gas station, running on a generator, opened 3 days later. The line to get gas stretched about 2 miles through town. Meals ready to eat were not all that bad. Some of them anyway. I had a radio but could only pick up one FM station, Kicker 108, a country music station. Everything else had been knocked out. The airwaves were empty. If I recall correctly, There were no television stations operating for the first week. I had a Neo Geo Pocket Color, a ton of batteries, and 10 to 15 games to keep me sane and occupied. The system is a great, massively underrated handheld with a top-notch library of high-quality games. Truly is a thing of beauty. I played it non-stop. I'm very glad I had it to keep me company and will always think fondly of the Neo Geo Pocket Color and my time with the system. When the power finally came back on, I stopped playing it and have never been able to play it since. The most amazing and stunning thing I remember was the night sky. No power for maybe a 60-mile radius also meant zero light pollution. I read that in Japan they call the Milky Way the Milky River, which I can understand. It's like a river of stars. I slept under that amazing view every single night for weeks. There are so many stars that modern life has robbed us of seeing. I'm not sure I'll ever see something that beautiful and awe-inspiring with my own eyes again. I also remember painting "Bush failed" on my roof out of sheer boredom for the passing helicopters and airplanes to read. It was actually visible on Google Earth for a while, which makes me somewhat proud. I didn't have a grill, so I took the rack out of the oven, put a few concrete blocks under it, and built a fire under it in my driveway so I could cook things like grilled cheese, boil water for ramen, and make coffee with a campfire percolator coffee pot. Bags of ice were a hot commodity. Some folks in Hattiesburg got shot over it, and the situation became so dire with the delayed deliveries of aid that the sheriff of Forest County in Hattiesburg and his deputies pulled their guns on some National Guardsmen at an aid distribution site and commandeered a few ice trucks that were just sitting there. Sheriff McGee became something of a local folk hero after that, and even had a song written for him titled "Haulin' Ice." Story 7. I lived in Shreveport. My mother was the executive director of a large nursing and rehabilitation facility. I was at the building volunteering when the first buses of evacuees started arriving. We took in 150 elderly and disabled people with nowhere to put them. For several days, we scrounged up beds from any source we could. We turned hallways and cafeterias into housing units. Staffing was incredibly short as we essentially doubled the census in a matter of hours. Low-quality workers quit immediately. It was absolute chaos for days. When I was not volunteering, I worked as a mechanic at a local shop my family owns. Our workload also doubled due to people with few resources making the 4 to 5 hour trek upstate with all of their belongings packed in. It was a wild time, and we were 300 miles away from New Orleans. It was a tragic time for the people of southern Louisiana. Story 8. I will never forget its aftermath, and neither should you. The United States government stood by and watched as the elderly, the poor, and people of color suffered and died. Story 9. Seeing corpses on the street on television because there were so many people dying and nobody to pick them up. That was so shocking and unreal. Those were people's family and loved ones. Story 10. I grew up in New Orleans and moved to New York after college. As it happened, I was in New Orleans on September 11, 2001, and in New York for Hurricane Katrina. So did I miss those events? Or was I spared having to endure them? I sometimes wonder. Watching the suffering after Hurricane Katrina was mind-bending. The atrocity of the Superdome, refugees being stopped from escaping to the West Bank, the unbelievable flooding. President George Bush's total lack of interest or coherent response. Bus caravans of refugees heading to Texas. This was 2005, only 2 years after the disastrous United States invasion of Iraq, a country that never attacked us on September 11th. Those 8 years of President Bush seemed like hell, like forever. But looking back, it seems like a sick joke compared to the situation we are currently in. Good luck after the next Hurricane Katrina. You will need it. Story 11. I remember a bet I made with my mother that we would not come home to a house. She won, thank heavens. We spent the evacuation in Nacogdoches, Texas. I was about 14, a freshman in high school. We did not have power for several weeks. That sticks out in my memory the most. Bored, hungry, thirsty, and hot. Story 12. My city took in many refugees from New Orleans, Gulfport, and other areas. We had every hotel full and rental properties occupied for quite a while. On the evening Hurricane Katrina hit, I remember working my shift at a local urgent care center. 1. of the supervisors in the back had one of the first phones with enough internet data to stream a live feed of a camera near New Orleans, close to Lake Pontchartrain, on her phone when the eye passed over. That live feed dropped the second the levees failed. We were also watching the Weather Channel on the lobby televisions. I heard them say that New Orleans had been spared and made it through the storm. Within a few minutes, reports started flooding in rapidly, saying a levee had failed. It became apparent within about 20 to 30 minutes that it was a massive failure. At that point, I looked around and every single employee, including physicians, was standing in the lobby staring at every television with shock, concern, and fear on our faces. I got home that night around 3:30 a.m. I was glued to the news all day. At the time, I wanted to move to New Orleans or one of its adjacent towns permanently. I had set up a job interview with a dentist in New Orleans about a week and a half after Hurricane Katrina, which I obviously didn't make it to due to the flooding. My ultimate goal was to get hired at Charity Hospital. It had been a childhood dream of mine to work there. Sadly, that did not happen because of the hurricane. Story 13. I was at the Internal Revenue Service National Tax Forum at the Atlanta Hilton in the elevator and saw the first footage of the storm on a small television in the elevator and thought, this is really bad. Story 14. I was a year out of high school. I grew up poor, but by the time I was in my late teens, my parents had worked their way up to the point where we took our first real family vacation to Disneyland in California Adventure. We would spend all day at Disneyland and then come back to the hotel, where every channel was talking about the devastation. I was literally at the happiest place on earth while all those people suffered. The contrast of those few days has always stuck with me. Anytime I think about Hurricane Katrina, I think about how we were finally able to take a family vacation. We had made it. Things were getting better. Life wasn't so stressful. We were going to be okay. It's mainly when I reflect on it. Story 15. Going on a road trip a year later and passing through the Gulf Coast. Most of Biloxi and a large part of New Orleans were just not there. Story 16. In Lakeview, my wife's cousin took his absent neighbor's boat off its trailer and rescued his family and several neighbors, bringing them out to Metairie, where the police took control of the boat and transported them to a shelter. Judicial precincts or Greater New Orleans police threatened to shoot anyone walking across the bridge. Waveland officials broke into Walmart to get food and water for citizens. Every one of the huge pine trees in our yard fell away from the house. Having a generator is not the same as having fuel for it. A New Orleans cousin said, "You wake up in the morning and realize your car is gone, your job is gone, and your house is under 12 feet of sewage." We still had our cars and jobs, and our house needed new shingles. We were lucky. Phones on different networks couldn't call each other. People learned texting. Before Hurricane Katrina, cell numbers were private. After Katrina, everyone had everyone's mobile number. I brought all the cash I could get from Pensacola. Everyone needed milk, bread, lettuce, and cash. Trucks passed out water, ice, and meals ready to eat. The Ku Klux Klan set up handouts in Pass Christian for whites only. No one would take them. Total collapse of government in Pass Christian. Mexican Marines guarded checkpoints. You couldn't get into Pass Christian without a Pass Christian address on your identification, not even to check on a friend's house. The community really pulled together. Neighbors who hadn't spoken to each other in years checked up and brought supplies. Story 17. I flew in relief supplies shortly after. Half of the lakefront airport runway was underwater. I had to land and take off on the remaining length. Even a year later, many of the street signs in downtown were still blown over. Story 18. I remember my town was one where refugees were passing through. I was disgusted by the actions of fellow residents. When word got around they were passing through, everyone went to buy groceries and bought out the stores before they arrived. I witnessed two women attack each other over the last loaf of bread while I awaited our restock truck. Many people express sympathy for the unfortunate, but as soon as they feel affected, cruelty is their first response. Story 19. I lived in New Orleans at the time, and I want to share something I saw that I have never heard about in the media regarding Will Smith and James Avery. My then-girlfriend and I had friends in Baton Rouge, about 1 hour further inland from New Orleans, and that is where we headed with all of our pets. While I say 1 hour with everyone evacuating, that trip took a full 8 hours, but we made it. We basically watched news coverage of the storm nonstop until we lost power. We ended up losing most of our possessions, but did not know that until we were allowed back into the city a few weeks later. For the first few days, we just focused on making sure we were safe and helping fix the small amounts of storm damage at our friend's house. After a while, though, the uncertainty became too much, and we went to the Louisiana State University campus where the American Red Cross had set up with evacuees to see if we could get information. Upon arrival, we were directed to a building a short distance away. To get there, we passed through a gymnasium lined with many rows of cots and full of families that had evacuated but had nowhere to stay. You may have seen footage of gyms like this on the news. They were shown constantly during the coverage. The American Red Cross representatives were set up on the other side of the gym, so we passed through and met with them. This was very important. We gave them the address where we were staying, and a few days later we both received checks from the Federal Emergency Management Agency. For 2 months before we moved back, this money was what we lived on. I do not know what we would have done without it. The Federal Emergency Management Agency messed up in many ways during the storm, but they also did some good. The important part of my story is that as we were walking back through the gym, we noticed a crowd in the far corner. We got closer and saw Will Smith and James Avery, who played Uncle Phil on The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. They were just hugging people, and it had become a group hug including children. Many people, including Will Smith and James Avery, were crying, and I will never forget it. There were hundreds of people, so I did not get a chance to get close and talk to either of them, but I watched as they talked with many people for a long time, signing anything if people asked and simply making those who had just lost everything feel better. I will never forget that, as big as Uncle Phil always seemed on television. And even though he was not a small man, Will Smith towered over him. He is huge. However, I have searched for information about this many times, and there is nothing. They brought no reporters or photographers. They just wanted to be good humans. We lost a great man when James Avery passed. I know Will Smith is getting a lot of negative attention right now, but I always balance anything negative I read about him against this memory, and I believe he is a good man at heart. Story 20. I remember how many women named Katrina were upset because people made bad jokes about their name. Not my wife. She loved it. She told people directly that she would do the same to them. I really love her. Story 21. My wife and I got married the weekend after Hurricane Katrina on September 3rd. We lived in central Louisiana at the time. My best man and one of my groomsmen, my brother-in-law, could not be at the wedding because they were deployed with the National Guard to help in New Orleans. We also had to cancel our honeymoon and ended up just driving to Dallas for a few days. We still had a great wedding and are happily married 20 years later. Our story is a minor inconvenience compared to those who lost everything. Story 22. My mom in California was admitted to the hospital on September 1st of that year. I remember spending hours in her hospital room watching coverage of the devastation and wondering how I would have gotten my mom safely out of our home if we had been there. For a while, I had nightmares about having to evacuate an immobile and bedridden mom to safety. I was also taking a psychology of stress class. The professor expressed her bewilderment at why people did not just evacuate, get those razor scooters if you do not have a car, and go. I still think that comment is the most ridiculous thing I have heard in my life, and I work a job providing government benefits. Story 23. I remember that when black people were shown coming out of stores with items, it was described as looting, and when white people were shown doing the same thing, it was described as finding. Story 24. This is when I started learning about the history of race relations and oppression in this country. As a middle-class white New England liberal, I had never experienced that level of poverty. I truly believed that the United States was a land of opportunity. The Iraq War had already radicalized me, but I saw that as a class struggle, not a racial one. The storm itself did not teach me this. The aftermath did. Story 25. Police shooting survivors. 5 officers pleaded guilty in post-Katrina shootings. Story 26. The Onion headline that week. God once again outdoes terrorism. Story 27. I had a friend who visited Louisiana shortly after all the calamity faded. He showed me a picture of a big box store sign, Walmart as I recall, bent 90 degrees. This was a big sign mounted on two I-beams, and these two I-beams were bent over 90 degrees. The immense force of those winds cannot be understood in conventional terms. I can't find any similar image online, but that image still sticks with me. Story 28. The day it happened, I was home watching mega disasters. If the levees broke on the History Channel and switching to the Weather Channel as they were documenting the levees breaking. Story 29. I have been employed with the state of Louisiana for the Department of Health since 1999. What I remember is how incredibly incompetent the New Orleans mayor, Ray Nagin, and especially the governor, Kathleen Blanco, were during the crisis. Governor Blanco was determined to be in charge no matter how overwhelmed she was. She refused repeated requests to allow the federalization of the Louisiana National Guard, which limited how the United States military could act within the state. Story 30. All the school buses in the storage yard were not used to evacuate people. Story 31. There is a lot of biased news coverage about people trying to survive. When a black person collects resources from a flooded shop, it is called looting and anarchy. When a white person does the same, they are described as being resourceful. Story 32. One of our meteorologists at the Weather Channel remembers the day the forecast shifted. The shock of knowing a storm that massive would make landfall had set in. Warnings were issued. Most of the area will be uninhabitable for weeks, perhaps longer, and reality set in. Story 33. The images of floating bodies I saw on the internet still haunt me. Story 34. I was in the technical training school in Biloxi, Mississippi, where you go after basic training for the United States Air Force. I had arrived in Mississippi a few weeks earlier and had never experienced a hurricane, but we had one my first weekend there that was a harmless Category 1. I had worried and bought a bunch of water bottles for myself as we sheltered in the schoolhouse for a night, but nothing happened. I had worried about nothing. When Hurricane Katrina was coming, the base commanders assumed it would be a one-night-only event, and we were expected to return to school without interruptions. We ended up sheltered inside the schoolhouse for 3 days straight. We washed ourselves in the bathroom sinks and someone made a makeshift shower in the janitor's closet. When we got out of there, we saw that everything around us was destroyed. Martial law was declared, as people were looting even on base. It was too dangerous to leave base, and there was nothing outside. So many people lost their homes, and we were eventually sent home. We returned a month later when things were mostly operational. Story 35. I lived in the uptown area and evacuated the night before contraflow started. I had never seen a storm cover the entire Gulf of Mexico on radar before, and I have lived through many hurricanes. I ran to my parents' house on the north shore of Lake Pontchartrain to ride out the storm with my pets, some clothes, and my personal computer. I figured I would be back in a few days at most. I did not see my house again for 5 months. I lost everything I owned that I did not take with me. Life at my parents' house, about an hour north, was no picnic either. Every day, I had to forage for food and generator fuel in an ever-widening circle. I did not travel unarmed because everything had to be paid for with cash. There were no cell phones, no electricity, and roads were impassable. It felt like a post-apocalyptic movie that never ended. It was the worst experience of my life, and I have lived 61 years. Story 36. Working in surgery at a level 1 trauma hospital, I was part of the primary team. I remember when they told us the levees failed. We knew then our patients were not getting out and we were not getting out, but I could never fathom what the next couple of days would bring. People breaking into the hospital, shooting at us, moving people wherever we could. Our emergency room physician was taking all the cats and dogs in distress and bringing them into the offices. Many hard decisions were made with the limited resources at hand. Then I saw that viral picture of the person stealing all the beer in waist-level water, and I pray to this day that he has paper cuts between all his fingers and toes. Story 37. I remember a lot of rain, a lot of wind, and getting 3 feet of water through our living room and the rest of the house. I remember the food lines, no electricity for weeks, traumatized cats, and not being able to move back into the house for over a year. I remember throwing away all the furniture, electronics, and appliances. I remember ripping out all the drywall. I could see from one end of the house to the other. I remember coming into the gutted house every few days to spray the studs to keep mold from growing. I remember trying to find contractors to rebuild the interior of our house. On the plus side, we realized we hardly ever used the living room, so we knocked down the wall between it and the den and now have a nice great room. I remember slowly replacing our belongings. Circuit City served us well. Funny story. We had a dishwasher go out on us, and the guy asked, "Do you remember when it was purchased?" Us. "Yeah, 2006. Him. "How do you remember?" Us. "All of our appliances were purchased in 2006. I remember halfway expecting to find a body in the swimming pool when we finally got around to cleaning it out. And I just remembered there is still a big nest in the attic that we do not know what was up there." Story 38. A news clip shows a black man with dreadlocks standing outside a crowded refugee center, screaming directly at the camera. This is not entertainment. This is not fiction. You are looking at actual real people. We need help. Story 39. I remember realizing that in the richest country on earth, if you are not wealthy or do not have the right skin color, you are mostly on your own. Story 40. Horror. Florida was recovering from 3 hurricanes. School was shut down for 2 weeks due to damage. I only watched what Hurricane Katrina did to Louisiana and was further traumatized by what people endured. Story 41. How I stay glued to the television in prayer and puddles of tears. I lived in New Orleans, Louisiana in 1978. Kind of souls I was privileged to meet. I was heartbroken that I could not help. It is the day I realized our leaders do not care. So we must. Story 42. It was very bad. I went there to help and everything was wrong. I shall leave it at that. Story 43. I was further inland in Mississippi, watching the rain blow sideways and then the eerie stillness as the eye passed over the house. Cell service was knocked out for weeks, and even when it returned, I had to text friends to ask them to call me because outgoing calls still failed across networks. My first incoming phone message, asking if I was okay, was from internet message board friends I had never met. We are still friends today. I was well supplied but still went to the emergency station just to get news. There were boxes of frozen chicken loaded up because distribution warehouses were full, and it was either give it out or let it rot. Running a television on the generator, I found out that most of the landmarks we knew on the coast no longer existed through helicopter footage on cable news. Finally, I got back to school and the internet only to find scammers frequenting a website I used. They told sob stories about dire conditions in Mississippi and claimed pictures taken the day after the storm were current, falsely saying they were from their hometowns despite being from multiple towns across the state. They did not expect anyone to be familiar enough with the area to notice and deleted the posts after being called out. For years afterward, it was difficult to get doctor appointments that were not scheduled months in advance due to the existing shortage of doctors in the area, the influx of people moving inland from Louisiana, and the interruption of medical education for local students. Story 44. George Bush saying, "You are doing an excellent job, Brownie." Story 45. All the children on the playground at recess were bullying the only girl named Katrina in the class. Story 46. The horrible stories of what took place in the dome where people evacuated. Story 47. Lived in Mandeville, on the lakefront. Evacuated to Jacksonville, Arkansas, the closest place I could find a hotel, for 13 days. The hotel I was originally staying at kicked me and other Louisiana residents out because they said we were going to loot. The sheriff got involved. He was very old school. Most of us ended up at a Comfort Inn down the road after making damage deposits. A local radio station was helping send water and supplies to people in New Orleans. My roommate and I went to help because we were bored, and after they saw our IDs, they were surprised and very kind. Didn't come back to a place to live or anything really. I'm pretty sure my stuff and my roommate's stuff was looted. Moved back to Baton Rouge and lived on the couch of my girlfriend's parents' house. Their family of about 30 were also from New Orleans, Metairie, and Laplace and had evacuated. Found out my college, Southeastern Louisiana University, was unhelpful to people affected by the hurricane. People in Baton Rouge were rude once they found out my phone number started with 985 or 504, so I changed my number to a 225 area code after a couple of months. Traffic in Baton Rouge is still horrible. The Federal Emergency Management Agency denied me assistance because the landlord I was renting from had already claimed aid on the house. It took me almost a decade to pay off the credit card debt from that year rebuilding my life. I was working at Starbucks at the time as a college student. They fired everyone at the Mandeville branch but then rehired us all, possibly due to a technical error. I was able to transfer to a Baton Rouge location, but the manager there paid us less and was later fired for stealing tips. He fired me because I missed a shift I wasn't scheduled for to meet with a financial advisor in Hammond, since there was basically no school for nearly 2 months. My grandparents in Metairie had street flooding, and their car somehow ended up sideways in the neighbor's yard. I guess the water moved it. Their house was on the energy power grid because they had power by the time I returned to Louisiana. Helped gut some houses in New Orleans East during the day. There was a curfew at night. Seeing an army tank come down the street basically saying, "Get inside or we will shoot," was still wild. Got a tetanus shot from stepping on rusty nails that went through my shoes. I was a poor college kid, so they were old and not the best. I ended up gutting some attorney's mom's house who needed help with his laptop, and I was able to get employment again because their IT guy moved to Houston. Did see some dead bodies after houses were cleared. Not sure if they were there during the storm or if it was a dumping ground after a fight or drug deal gone bad. It still sucked to see. New Orleans changed almost overnight and still hasn't fully recovered. It's not the same friendly, moderately peaceful place it used to be. But also, shout out to Jabbar Gibson, who helped get about 70 or 80 people out. Story 48. Before it hit land, a number of megachurch preachers claimed people did not have to evacuate or seek shelter. They just had to pray because prayer reduces hurricanes. They then boarded their crowd-funded jets and left their large churches locked to hide from the storm. When they returned and saw the extent of the damage, they blamed gay people. Story 49. I remember watching the aftermath on the news, and it was horrific. They would not allow people to walk on this bridge or interstate, but everything else was flooded. The Superdome was apparently a mess. I remember Geraldo Rivera being there live, getting choked up about the people standing there whom they would not allow to leave, saying, "Let these people walk out of here." It was truly shocking how vulnerable you are when things go wrong. The government is not saving you. I think it was Shepard Smith who got emotional, but Geraldo was also very passionate. Story 50. I was a kid watching from Canada. I vividly remember watching Celine Dion on cable news network asking how it is so easy to send money and planes to bomb other countries, but they cannot help their own citizens. She was angry about government inaction and the heavy focus on looting. It was a moment in my life when I began to explore politics and environmental racism. I would say it was a pivotal moment in my belief system as a child. Story 51. Flying in from Europe to Florida, I was on the last plane to land in Miami. Instead of a layover, I was stuck there for 3 days. It was and remains the last time I will go to Florida. Story 52. Some people expressed absolute joy at the devastation because it affected those people. A local radio host mused about life in New Orleans now that it has been cleansed. Story 53. That was 20 years ago. I was 1 year old when that happened. I have heard about it so often over the years that I thought it happened more recently than 20 years ago. Wow. Story 54. Dead body reports in the Superdome halls. Kanye West said George W. Bush hates black people, which seemed accurate as all the television footage clearly showed not white people. The victims were shuttled to random states and many never came back. Story 55. My former assistant and longtime friend speaks about it a lot, as she was in her early 20s living in New Iberia when it happened. I remember taking a tour around Lake Pontchartrain a few years later and seeing all the houses with an X on them still standing. My first wife, who used to travel there on business before and after in the 2000s, said that New Orleans lost most of its spirit because the people who made up the unique local culture had all died or left and were replaced by generic transplants. One example she gave was that in 2003, she used to stay at a hotel near the riverboat in New Orleans. She liked staying there because everyone was extremely nice to her. The rooms were very unique and clean, and the staff was better than most four-star hotels. An old-world charm, and I felt like I was cared about as a guest. After Hurricane Katrina, the hotel was like every other airport Marriott I have ever stayed at, with staff that did the bare minimum, and all the unique rooms were replaced with furnishings similar to 90% of the travel hotels out there. New Orleans lost its soul. It went from a spicy, unique flavor to just a tourist trap like Las Vegas or Disneyland. The locals I knew from work told me that it's because all the people who used to work those jobs were dead, forced to move because they had nowhere to live or otherwise forced out. It was like New Orleans had gone from a real place to just another theme park. Story 56. I remember talking to a friend about how we kept getting these major storm of the century alerts, and it felt like none of them ever actually hit. It seemed like hyping up false alarms for ratings. Then Hurricane Katrina hit directly, and we saw why we have those warnings. It is concerning that funding has been cut for the science behind this warning system. There is definitely something to worry about if we are not paying attention. Story 57. It came across South Florida from the Atlantic around Palm Beach County and entered the Gulf of Mexico as a Category 1 storm. Locally, we had minimal damage, but that was not the case for New Orleans and the other Panhandle Gulf states. Story 58. I remember Highway 45 being all one direction north and having to take back roads to work. Story 59. I remember watching the aftermath on the news, and a news crew kept their focus on someone who had drowned. I clearly remember seeing this man, face down, wearing a white shirt and jeans, just dead. They kept the camera on him for an uncomfortably long time. Story 60. I donated about half of my belongings to a family who was relocated to Maryland. Clothes, furniture, a computer, electronics. Felt good to do it, but still I feel empty. Be better, America. Story 61. I still remember it like it was yesterday. We were fortunate to evacuate before the storm hit. I was a student then, so I grabbed my books to study over the weekend. It was surreal watching it all unfold on television over the next few days. My heart still breaks for the many helpless people who went through that time. Story 62. I wasn't there and I didn't live through it, and I don't want this to sound insensitive in any way. I had a trip planned to go see a friend. The trip had been planned well in advance for a date about a week after it happened. I'm a big funk fan, so I was especially excited to go to New Orleans and soak in the music scene. Well, the Big Easy was devastated, so that part of the trip obviously got canceled. We met up with another friend who was living in Florida at the time. He worked on a nice golf course and managed to get a tee time for all three of us. The first several holes seemed completely normal until we rounded a dogleg. It was a complete mess, and that's it. A few holes on a golf course, I didn't see anything else that was destroyed. My friend showed me photos of what it had looked like a week prior. My hat goes off to the crews that cleaned up everything, and my heart goes out to those whose lives were marked by this. Story 63. Too young to understand the severity, but old enough to watch it unfold on live television. Story 64. Aside from everything else, I personally remember the storm heading inland to Arkansas. My sister almost died in a car crash because there was so much rain it washed out the road we lived on, and she could not see it. Story 65. We had just moved into our house. The television was on a lot as I walked around putting things away. I had not heard much about it. I recall sitting down at one point to watch some footage, and as I sat there, my eyes started welling up. Soon, I had tears streaming down my face as the realization hit me that many people were killed or had their lives ruined. Story 66. If you could drive out, you could leave at any time. If you could only walk out, it was not allowed, and you might get shot for trespassing or suspected looting. Story 67. The smell and the destruction. Learning that I was now homeless with nothing. Trying to help my community but knowing that our efforts were falling short. I still have terrible dreams about it. Story 68. George Bush dislikes black people. The look on Mike Myers' face when he said that was amusing. Story 69. That man with the cases of Heineken who became the symbol for all looters. Story 70. I remember the complete lack of leadership and police presence in New Orleans. Many police officers called off work that day. It was not long after the September 11th attacks, so the difference between the leadership and first responders in those two cities was shocking. Say what you will about Rudolph Giuliani, but he was America's mayor during the September 11th attacks, and the first responders were the bravest people I had ever seen. During Hurricane Katrina, it was quite the opposite. I believe the mayor of New Orleans went to prison shortly after Katrina for corruption. Story 71. Total racism, indifference, and incompetence of the United States and Louisiana state government. Story 72. I have an audio recording of Barbara Bush commenting on people stranded at the arena. And so many of the people in the arena here, were underprivileged anyway, so this is working very well for them. It was an offensive comment beyond measure. I kept the audio file and named it Barbara Bush, Insensitive Comment. Story 73. Sleeping in my mama's laundry room with a fridge pushed against the door. There was a gap where I could peek outside through the glass. What I saw was true devastation that movies have not recreated. The sky that day is the most vivid memory I have, and I was a very young child. I could tell you what the laundry room smelled like, the color of the grout in the tiles on the floor. Everything about those moments is permanently burned into my mind, and I have not even thought of it in decades. Story 74. George Bush does not like black people, followed by an awkward glance from Michael Myers. Story 75. I was a sophomore in college. I remember being shocked to my soul that something so terrible could happen in my country. Not just the physical destruction caused by the storm, but also the government's response. I think it was one of the first times I realized how much worse African Americans are treated compared to white people and the blatant racial hatred. Story 76. I am from South Carolina. After the storm, my grandmother, who only spoke Greek, and I received free food at McDonald's because they thought we were refugees, or more accurately, people affected by the storm. Story 77. Institutional ineptitude is the inevitable result of a governing body with little interest in actual governance. Story 78. I learned that there is a city on the coast that is below sea level. Story 79. I remember a president who was considered the worst until recently handled the situation horribly. The administration took a long time to react, and displaced people never got to return home. Story 80. If you are white, it is scavenging. If you are black, it is looting. Story 81. I remember writing off the storm just like any other, and it did not really affect my area. Rita, on the other hand, caused significant impact. Story 82. I lived in Florida, and around that time we were also hit by Hurricane Wilma. Caused some damage, including to my home. It did not receive much attention due to Hurricane Katrina. I am not arguing, just stating. Going through what I did gives me much more empathy for those impacted by Hurricane Katrina. Story 83. The chaos and madness that was there. Everything destroyed and the aftermath where I was convinced that Kanye West was an absurd left-winger. Clearly wrong on that one. Story 84. I remember working for a phone company network operations center. I had gotten a nasty flu and was off sick from work when all of our southern offices lost power and service for multiple days. Apparently, our office was incredibly busy. Story 85. I remember earlier that year I briefly dated a girl who was excited that there was finally going to be a hurricane named after her. Unfortunately, we broke up before I could get her take on it. Story 86. I was working in Alaska driving tour buses for cruise lines at the time. I had no television and this was before smartphones, so news was hard to come by. One day, another driver and I were grabbing a snack in the gift shop at one of the tour stops, and we started watching television. Apparently, New Orleans was completely underwater and chaos was unfolding. It had been going on for several days at that point, and we were completely unaware. News about the continental United States often isn't seen as a high priority by Alaskans, and it was surprising to me that something that significant could happen and nobody we talked to mentioned it. Story 87. I worked with an evacuee who was in the Superdome for a couple of weeks and told me some incredible stories. Story 88. How much better our food in Texas became and how many hidden racists I knew. Story 89. It took my parents 23 hours to drive from New Orleans, Louisiana to my house in Beaumont, Texas. Story 90. I worked Helene as well. These hurricanes devastated communities in their own way, each historically significant. Respectfully, I will explain the primary differences. Despite the focus on New Orleans, Hurricane Katrina was far larger than the general public understands. People died in Biloxi, Mississippi, and it was barely mentioned in the news. Also, the media coverage was terrible. The Ninth Ward was shown repeatedly, by every outlet. It was bad. But the reason it got so much coverage was that New York primetime news anchors flew in and rented entire floors in high-rise hotels overlooking Bourbon Street. From those balconies, the flooding in the Ninth Ward was visible. A short walk allowed Anderson Cooper to get his heart-wrenching interview and then return to a hot shower, room service, and the bar. The devastation extended for miles on both sides of the river, in Louisiana and Mississippi. The population affected by Katrina was much larger. Because New Orleans is below sea level, the water remained for 3, 4, or 5 weeks before it naturally receded. Helene was disastrous for other reasons. North Carolina rivers topped the historic levels of 1941. Families living along those rivers in 1941 were wiped out and rebuilt 12 feet higher. Those buildings flooded during Helene. While devastating, it directly affected far fewer people. This was not supposed to happen here. Very few were insured for flooding because they were not in a flood zone, and flooding was unimaginable. The water from Helene came in fast and left quickly. However, it took bridges and winding mountain roads with it. The main challenge during Helene was access because many small towns had only one way in and out, and the bridge was gone. If those who suffered in Helene can appreciate anything, it is that these towns will rebound and life will return. With Katrina 20 years later, the scars in New Orleans, the Ninth Ward, Chalmette, and other areas are still very obvious. These parts of Greater New Orleans will never recover their population because they serve as a historical warning sign for development. Story 91. The animals, specifically dogs, were abandoned in the city. They formed packs, became feral, and ate all the cats and small dogs. Story 92. I was pretty clueless about world and national events at the time, during my freshman year of college. Even I knew the situation was bad. I heard about the Thunderdome and saw footage of people standing on their roofs only feet away from a rushing lake of water. Deadly. Learning about how poorly President George W. Bush handled everything was part of the beginning of my shift away from religious conservatism. Then my city got their basketball team, and a bunch of other students from there transferred hastily to my school. I want to say my university did a good job integrating them. I know they made special efforts, events, and exceptions when needed for those students. But I don't know if those students would say the same. I honestly don't know how most of them graduated after something so traumatic. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.